Hello, everybody. Welcome back. And we are in week number 2 of the flow chakra. So even though I'm saying week number 1 here, what I want to do is do a quick recap before we dive into the body parts that align to the flow. So I'm kind of curious how you did last week with looking at some heavy hitting kind of topics. So looking at creativity, emotions, relationships as part of that. And so just as a refresher, wanting to revisit and see how you did with some of the activities if you engaged with them. So one of the ones that we had was the 7 creatives. Curious if you had some time to dialogue with one of the creatives or more of the creatives that you felt called to. And if you did, that's great. I'm curious what you uncovered and discovered. And if you didn't, don't feel like that's just part of week 1. You can bring that into week 2 as well. And also, don't forget about the emotion log. If you really wanted to dive deep into the emotions, what would be really interesting would be to track your emotions for the whole month to the moon cycle, which would be the whole month. So just wanted to give you a reminder on that. Did have some reading and some videos for you. And so just again, what I'm trying to do here is give you a sprinkling. So a more intuitive approach, like looking at the artist's way, and then even bringing in some science, bringing in some things that I have written or even made videos of. So again, those are all optional for, maybe it's late on a Friday and you just feel like zoning out and you want to watch a short video on the flow. So the journaling activity was to talk with your inner creative. I'm a big fan of doing this talking exercise and doing it in such a way that you kind of take on the part of you talking and having the response come from you as well, assuming the role of whatever you're responding to. Partner activity, wondering how all of you did on your partners and whether or not you had some time to share with them your emotions. And if you didn't, to create some space to have that sharing for yourself and to honor your emotions. You could even do what I was talking about with the 7 creatives with the different emotions. Like if you really have a problem with anger. So one of the things that came up for me this past week was looking at anger in my life and looking at how growing up with anger in the household and with trauma, emotional trauma around anger, and then seeing how that manifests in my life. And I'm exploring that through my dream patterns. And so, discussing this with that emotion, whatever emotion you kind of have some connection to, or you're feeling some polarity with, that would be a great flow term. It might be worthwhile to actually dialogue in a journal style or a visual or auditory style with something like one of the emotions. And you can even make a vision board with, let's just take anger as that example, or a vision board of what does grief look like? I think that when these things come alive, as one of my Jungian teachers would say, it creates a sense of curiosity and it moves things from shadow into light so that we can engage. And it's not to fear them, it's simply to create relationship with them. All right, so we're going back into this flow of now week 2, where things become a little bit more tangible. And so instead of just focusing on high level, big themes, now we're going to distill this down a bit into the body. And I always love talking about the body because it's what I studied and it's what we see. And so many times it's so much easier to relate to body parts. And we might have health conditions relating to these body parts. And so I want to look at some of those, traverse those as we move on through. So now, if you recall on this 7 systems operating chart that I have and use for all of my teaching, the flow is quite vast, much like each of the other systems. And so rather than inundate everybody with talking about all the different body parts, what I tried to do was focus on the 3 main ones, and then from there kind of talk about offshoots. And so to revisit, if we look at all of the flow physiological organs, so the anatomy would be the urinary tract, which encompasses the kidneys. Kidneys are heavy hitters, so I wanted to call them out a little bit separately. The hips and sacrum, which I don't have listed here, but this is the general area of the body, and I did allude to that in our first week of the flow in that video. The large intestine, or the colon, which regulates water resorption. And so that's going to tie into our discussion of water. I felt like it was more comprehensive to talk about water in the body because that floods into so many different topics rather than just saying colon. But as part of talking about water, surely we can talk about movement and motility and colonic flow, and even to reflect on microorganisms. I also have the reproductive system listed here. So I do want to talk about the reproductive system, talk a little bit about hormones. And the intent here is not to get deeply physiological. It's to give you a general understanding so that you can apply a lot of these concepts of creativity, emotions, relationship, what you've already learned and built upon from that kind of overarching theme concept and now into the body. If we look at the physiological function, that's why when I took my college course on anatomy, it wasn't just anatomy, it was anatomy and physiology, because each of these organs connect to a function, and that is their physiology. So physiological activities would be cellular replication and growth, which, if you think of the reproductive system, is very much aligned with that. Fat storage, and all. Now you'll note that I don't have fat listed here. Fat is going to come up when we start talking in the third week about dietary fats and oils. But in general, fat storage, fat as a storage depot, but then also the flow of fat tissue in our body is great, big, huge. Because, I mean, let's just take the brain. The brain is 60% fat. It's a very fatty organ. If you were to take it out, it would be very fat-like, very oily. And so much of how we think is garnered and really shepherded by the fats that we have in our brain. And so we do need to be thinking about fat storage, where we have fat in our bodies, and what happens when we start following a low-fat diet. And so I'll get more into that in that third week. Reproduction in general, so reproducing new cells, reproducing a new organism for women, reproducing in the way of ovulation for women. I am going to talk about the menstrual cycle in this particular presentation. And then water balance. Water balance is the other physiological function. And so when there is swelling in the body, you wake up and your eyes are all kind of puffy, or sometimes after a long day of being on one's feet, there's swelling in the ankles, to kind of see where things settle. Water is really good at pooling and settling. And it's one of the, it can create a lot of flow, but it can also create a lot of stagnation. It can pool. It can pool in the body. And so that's why things like even passive activity like massage, using a roller, just doing simple things. If we don't feel like going to the gym or going outside or doing anything laborious, we can create subtle movement. That's why if you've ever had lymphatic drainage or any kind of cranial sacral massage or body work, what you'll note is that those modalities are incredibly subtle. In fact, I remember when I first had cranial sacral, I was thinking that that the massage therapist didn't do it right, because I was like, well, where's I'm not feeling anything. So many of these things can be very subtle, but water needs to move. The nature of water is to move. And so when water is not moving, that's when we get all kinds of health issues. So let's begin with water, because water from a physiological standpoint is what comprises most of our bodies. So we are drinking water, we bathe in water. It's like there is no escape from water, even if we live in a very dry climate. And it seems that even when there are if you visit or if you live in a dry climate, you know how much of a fixation there is on water, having enough water, and how important that is. And so let's start with some of the basics of just even drinking water, the importance of water. I'm going to get a little sciencey here on this. The human body is, as we know, there are different estimates, but essentially 60 to 80% water. And there are ways that you can assess your water content. If you've ever done a bioimpedance analysis, BIA, where they connect different electrodes at your extremities, on your hands and on your feet, they conduct an electrical current, and then there's an algorithm for the speed of how fast that electrical current is conducted through the body, and it can tell you about the resistance, and that translates into telling you something about water. There's also a way within that device to look at intracellular water, which is the water inside the cell, and extracellular water, which is the water outside the cell. So you want a happy balance. You don't want a lot of the water. So that's why, I mean, you could be dehydrated even though you have water in your body. All that water can be outside the cell, not within the cell, creating flow. So it's not just, it's almost like, body weight. When people say that somebody's a certain body weight, that doesn't say a whole lot, because where is the body weight? What is it comprised of? How much of that is water? How much of that water is intracellular? How much of that is extracellular? And so I have noticed that, and this is perhaps more anecdotal, that hydration is so important for so many things. And there is some science around mixing hunger and hydration signals. So are you really thirsty or are you hungry? And so oftentimes, to first fulfill the need for water, because that is a very basic requirement, our body cannot make water. Our body can make energy from our fat stores and give us ATP and fuel. But water is a very unique feature, and much of our physiology is run based on water and whether or not we're dehydrated. Our thinking, our cognitive capacity can be impacted by just even subtle amounts of dehydration. So if you're low in energy, check for dehydration, drink some water. I remember, I think it was Tom O'Brien who said that one of his teachers had mentioned as he was going through chiropractic school, that one of the first things they had grown accustomed to was every morning when they would wake up is drinking 2 glasses of water. So that's like a very basic primal need. We're in the chakras that are very connected to our survival. And of course, the root chakra is the base of that, but we do continue on in that discussion with the flow. And so water is a basic necessity. We cannot go very long without having water. In fact, even as I'm talking about it, I'm like wanting to have a sip of tea. It's just amazing how I wish that there was an app where people could assess their dehydration level, not just by counting the number of glasses, but an actual sensor that could tell you. And maybe you can tell me if there is something like this, but I'm not aware of anything that can tell you about your hydration status. Something as basic as water level, and most of us have no clue about. Oftentimes we can look at indirect assessments, like looking at the quality of our skin, our lips, are they dry and cracked? Just even our salivary activity. But oftentimes it's not just about water, those things. It's really about how the fat is holding the water. And so purity of water, too, is another thing to consider in our discussion this week, the purity of water and how many people are drinking bottled water. And, one of the first things that, I think about when I start thinking about toxic elements in the environment is to be sure that we're taking in pure water. And so one of the things that I recommend when I am lecturing on detoxification, especially in the functional medicine sphere, is to get your water at home tested. I had a client about a year ago where I went to their home to do a home visit, and I noticed that they had bottled water, that they had a refrigerator full of bottles of water. And I asked them, I said, did you get your water tested to know that you need purified water? Is this why you have all these bottles? I got a little concerned because of all the plastic and the health condition of the person that I was there to see. And so, no, there was no evaluation of water. And so I said, well, why don't you get your water checked? It's $150, but it will give you a lot of good information. It'll give you 6 pages of minerals and contaminants and pH and microbial contamination. And so this couple had their water assessed, and they had like some of the best medicinal water, no contaminants at all. And they had high minerals in this water. Now, they live in a very nice community. And so it was actually no surprise to me that their water would be pure because, you know, they're in this particular living subdivision that I'm sure has tight regulations on water. But not only that, some of them aren't very tight, and you have to go and look under the hood and start looking at all these individual contaminants like pesticides. So this particular test that I use, that's based in the United States, is really good with analyzing that. So know your water. When you know your water, you know yourself. When I'm traveling and on the road, one of the things I've noticed, and this is anecdotal, this is not science-based, is that I've experimented with different waters when I'm on the road, and oftentimes what I'll do is I'll bring a stainless steel bottle. I'm not a huge fan of stainless steel, but glass is very heavy and not as safe when I'm traveling. So I do bring a thin thermos-like container that I can fill up with purified water at airports and such. But when I am actually stationed at a hotel or somewhere, I can go up to the store, and I've been trying out different waters, not in plastic water bottles, but whether it's glass or the UHT containers, you know, like the paper containers. And there's one water, and I know because my lips get dry and I can tell if I'm dehydrated. And there's one water that works for me. And I have no stock in this company, no nothing. So it's not like I'm pitching it from a marketing perspective or commercial interest, but this water is actually called Flow. And so sometimes even at home, if I feel like it's a more alkaline water, so I don't remember the pH of the water, but for some reason, there's something about this water. And often what I'll do is I'll take purified water and just sprinkle a little bit of pink Himalayan salt into the water to create a better, more osmotic effect with water being absorbed and kind of through passive diffusion and osmotic flow to enable that to move, because water will follow the point of highest concentration. You probably remember that from basic biology. So, yeah, we need to be looking at our hydration status and how much activity we have, how much flow and movement we have, what is the humidity outside. And I think it's really important to be drinking water. There's also a general rule of thumb that we need about half our body weight in ounces, or if you don't think in ounces, which only the very limited United States is thinking ounces. I think everybody else is more metricized, and I like the metric system as well. But an average of about 2 liters or 6 to 7 8-ounce glasses per day. And that's variable, you know, looking at our urine, looking at how our kidneys are processing that is important too. And are we getting fluid from other things like eating more fruit or having greens, or are we having soups or broths, because that will help to bring in some water. So yeah, water is important, as you're getting the drift of. I did mention that there's a correlation between lower amounts of hydration and cognition. And indeed, here's one particular study. This was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This was in 2016. Showed that drinking water improved memory and focused attention. And in the short term, thirst was associated with poorer memory. So even before I lecture and when I'm lecturing, if I have a day-long seminar, you bet I've got water up there with me. I have all kinds of water types with me. Definitely have my Flow water, which I really like. I need to look into that water a little bit more as to why my body responds. And again, why anecdotally am I saying this, I can just tell because my lips, I just feel plumped up or something. I can always tell when I'm pretty sensitive to my skin and how I feel in it, and my fingers, my lips, my eyes, and yeah, just drinking certain kinds of water, I have noticed a difference. So I'm curious if you have noticed that for yourself. To proceed with this study, later a greater loss of body mass was associated with poorer memory and attention. At 90 minutes, an increase in thirst was associated with a decline in subjective energy and increased anxiety and depression. Isn't that interesting? How hydration can be impacting our mood status. So it's not just our memory and cognitive ability, it's also mood. At 180 minutes, subjects found tests easier if they had consumed water. So if you have to take a test, you need to sit and focus. Hydrate, hydrate, hydrate. Really important. Drinking water was shown in this study for the first time to our knowledge to benefit cognitive functioning when there was a loss of less than 1% of body mass at levels that may occur during everyday living. Like, these are not exorbitant losses, like where you have to be an athlete and you're sweating profusely. So even small amounts of water loss can affect our cognitive ability. So go there as one of your first things to be thinking about, is look at if you want more flow in the brain, focus on more flow in your body with water. So on the note of flow and movement and water, how do we move this stuff around? So we can get the water in our bodies, but how is it actually moving from compartment to compartment? Because you can have all that water coming in, but if you're stagnant and not creating flow in any way, then you're not distributing those to the tissues. So there's a spectrum of movement, much like there's a spectrum of anything else. And I know that when I'm really tired and I don't feel like engaging in any kind of active movement, one of the things that I do is I use a foam roller. I have a large lavender colored foam roller, and I will just lay on the floor and just kind of roll my arms over it gently, kind of in a lymphatic style. I'll roll my back on it gently. And it's not something that's going to tucker me out, but it is something that is going to keep my tissues moving. Another simple thing, just kind of in that passive way, is even to set up, like if you're sitting a lot and you have a desk job, if there's a way to ergonomically set up your desk so that you're sitting, you're standing, you're sitting, you're standing, even that subtle motion is important. I know that under the desk, they have different foot raises and bars and things that you can put your feet up on. There's also in yoga, I love feet up against the floor, the wall, just to create reverse circulation. I have in our garage an inversion board, an inversion table, which I always feel is kind of risky, and I don't do it very often. But I like the idea of reversing flow, because so much of flow goes with gravity. So it's actually, gravity is not working in our favor when it comes to our brain, which is why we have to engage in things like movement in order to propel flow into those areas that just naturally are not being met through our everyday subtle movements. And then, of course, there are more, some people like more moderate, intense activities, like looking at heart rate, taking 220 minus your age, and then looking at 50 to 75% of that as kind of like a target heart rate to kind of get the heart rate up. I've never been so focused on numbers when it comes to flow, other than just counting my steps. I do count my steps using an app, which is kind of fun. And I have a contest going with my dad, and we send each other our steps almost every day. It's kind of fun. So, but there are ways to assess movement. And if that is something that really sparks you, I think it's so important to remain engaged and to personalize movement, and to not do what you don't enjoy. One of the things about the flow that we've been discussing is how important play and fun is. It's going to be even more important when we get up to the fire. So if we don't establish it now, it becomes even more. It's like, wow, now we got to work even more and bring that into the fire, which we will do in different ways through joy. But with movement, it is so important to have a sense of play. One of my favorite movements too is Nia, N-I-A, Nia. That was introduced to me. I was at a functional medicine conference, and I happened to go to one of the early morning sessions that they had offered on Nia. And I'm not a very coordinated person. Perhaps that's a limiting belief, but I do mix up my right and my left quite often if I'm dancing. Even when I was teaching yoga, I had to really focus on, okay, my left, your right, and kind of work in that way. But Nia is really, there's nice music, there's rhythmic movement. It's not a dance class per se, but there are some harmonized movements. And so even at the Insight Retreat that we're doing in September, I'm having a friend of mine come out from Boulder, Colorado, and she's going to do the Nia sessions in the morning. She did it last year as well, and it was just so fun. And there's nothing like helping the brain than having movement where you have to synchronize both sides of the body. Again, that's a very flow thing to do, is right, left side, masculine, feminine side, yin and yang side. It's really important to connect both of those sides of the body. And what I would say is, look on both sides of your body. Is there one side that exhibits more complaints or symptoms? Usually when I think of the left side of the body, my left right here, I think of the feminine. When I think of the right side of the body, I think of the masculine part of us. So when I think of feminine, yin, I think of softness and receptivity and passivity. And when I think of the masculine side, it's like, okay, what are we being too action oriented on? What are we fighting too much about? How are we being too much of a warrior on something? So even when I had my reproductive issues, they were on my left side. So I began again to translate this as, oh, wow, my feminine is really calling me right now. So see if there's a difference for you in your right and left side. Do you feel, do you have kind of uneven posture on one side more than the other? For women, if they carry purses, many times they have a shoulder that's lower than the other. So much about posture can say where we're at with our body balance. So yeah, engage in movement that you feel passionate and fun and playful about. It's got to be that has to enter into it. As part of that movement, let's talk for a second, because usually people think of muscles. They think of muscles and bones. They think of the musculoskeletal system, which actually belongs to the root. Those are large structural elements that give us our body and the ability to be functional and to move. But there are a lot of interlocking pieces that hold all of that together, like connective tissue. And when I think of fascia and the lymph and lymph nodes under the arm and throughout our body, creating flow of fats and immune factors. So the substance of lymph and the substance of fascia are considered flow, but the movement of them, the circulation, the circulatory qualities, I put under the love. So in a similar way, red blood cells belong to the root, but the circulation of red blood cells through the blood vessels belongs to the love. And with breast tissue, lymphatic circulation a lot in this area, the circulatory aspects of that belonging to the love. We'll talk more about that when we get up into the heart area. But the actual substance, the yellowish substance that houses fats primarily, like when we eat a meal with lots of saturated fat, the way that we move that from the gut into the organs is through lymph. Thank goodness we have lymph. Otherwise, because our blood is watery, plasma, serum is watery, and fat and water don't mix. So we need something to make that bridge. And the lymph has both immune watery factors and fat immune factors as well. And so these two things can coexist. So lymph is a great way to think about the flow. It's the emulsification process of these fats with water? Like, how do we bring them together in the body? The lymph is a great way to see that. And the fascia, you know, like the fine mesh that is just right under the skin layer, kind of acting as a network. And the way that I look at fascia as it relates to flow is as a communicating web, right? And so things can ripple through. And if we think of acupuncture, and there's some great work, again, from Helene Langevin at Harvard, talking about mechanotransduction with an acupuncture needle, that it is connecting into the connective tissue, it's connecting into fascia, and it's creating a mechanotransduction. There's like a signal that is transmitted. And in traditional Chinese medicine, we might think of these as meridians. But in Western medicine, this would be seen as transportation along all of these fascial networks and highways. And again, this is where the work of John Upledger and looking at cranial sacral work and the great impact of working subtly on fascia and lymph through cranial sacral work. You know, a lot of the lymph is all throughout the body. Lymph nodes are all throughout the body. So that's another reason, you know, thinking of circulation, moving it through. So good, healthy lymph is important to have. And we want to be sure that those things are circulating. So yes, dehydration. So I have this here because I've been talking about hydration. I want you to think about dehydration and water in a metaphorical sense. So again, the root, earth element, water is connected to the flow. And where do we need more flow in our lives? Where are things getting crusty and cracked and creviced? And where do we need more suppleness? Where do we need more flexibility? Where do we need fluidity and movement? So even if you feel like stopping here and pausing me and just doing a little bit of a journaling activity and saying, okay, where do I need more hydration? Not just in my body, but in my life. Again, revisiting some of the concepts that we were talking about with creativity and even emotions. Being earthed in water. The beach. What a great place to be for many people. You know, it's such a great blend of root and flow. And when I think of the body as a structure, it's really amazing to think of how we are the earth element and the water element in this unified fabric. We're kind of like a mini planet Earth. Because when you look at the earth, a lot of green and a lot of blue, you have a lot of the earth, you have a lot of the water. And we are that as well. And so how do we, again, go back to the root and ground and be earthed at the same time, assuming our watery primordial soup being, right? And having them both. And I always feel like going to a beach and getting close to the ocean brings me back to that feeling. Kind of brings me back to that motherly feeling. If we think of water signs from an astrological perspective, water signs, very mothering, nurturing, emotional. And so, again, standing within our earth, water, body. Here's another concept of that is physiological, but also psychological. And I like to always bridge the two. So bubbling up and effervescence. These words came to me as I was putting together these slides, and I had this image. And it's kind of like, have you ever just been inspired about something where it's kind of like you get a bubbling up, you get a welling up. It's almost like when tears well up, but this is like in a happy way. This effervescence, it's a lightness of being. So even though water can feel very heavy and stagnant and stuck, there is a sense of bubbles. Bubbles, you know, and you might even want to play with some bubbles. Go buy a little thing of child's bubbles and experience that lightness that water oil mixtures can take on. You know, have some play, that effervescence, you know, noting the bubbles coming out of water, like if you have sparkling water, bubbles, what is getting, what is moving through us in this bubble-like way, where this could even be used as a great meditation tool, right? To be thinking about things bubbling up and out, maybe vocalizing certain things that have been sitting within you for some time. So I like that concept, right? This is more in line with healing and using a derivation of the water element, but then also bringing in fats and oils and kind of mixing these two. So I broached the topic a little bit in week 1 about flower essences, essential oils, and this would be a great week to play around with them. If you feel like you really know a lot about flower essences and essential oils, feel free to share with our community what you know and make some posts, give us some resources. If you know nothing, I would say, what about dipping your toe in the water of exploring? One of my first, when I was in my late 20s, I was introduced to flower essences in a more profound way. I took a course on flower essences. This is now like 2 decades ago. And what drew me to the course was that it was all about boundaries. And I didn't feel like I had very good boundaries at that time in my life. And so the course was all about people who are highly emotional and emotionally sensitive. And for people that are emotionally sensitive, what you might find, and I have found this for myself, so again, this is anecdotal, this is not science-based, was that there's so much with the sense of getting at something in a sensitive way that is sensitive. So using flower essences, which are very subtle, to help with things that are very subtle. So it's almost like meets like. Essential oils tend to be stronger. So I wouldn't call them subtle, but there's a spectrum of essential oils where some are more subtle than others. But the flower essences are very interesting. One of my favorites, and again, I'm not wedded to this commercially, so I'm just talking about what I use. Some people like using Bach flower remedies, which are a little bit different than flower essences. There's a company called Flower Essence Society, FES, and their colors are purple and white. Usually, you go to their website, everything is all like this deep, rich hue of purple. But I love their essential oils, not essential oils, the flower essences. They have a very nice sampler of different ones that you can use for different emotions. So when I was really trying to navigate my emotions and feeling kind of out of sorts, sometimes I would just put a couple of drops of these flower essences into my water and drink them. And you don't even know that they're there. And what I like about flower essences is that because they're so subtle, they truly are, if we think of first do no harm, you're not, it's kind of like homeopathy, although probably even a notch down from homeopathy. They're very subtle. And so you have to kind of connect with their personality and what they offer. I am definitely not an expert in homeopathic medicine by any means, but I know I do have some books that talk about the remedies almost as entities, people, ways to connect, and so I think of the flower essences in some way. So if there's a flower that you feel very drawn to, and flowers are very important for us talking about the flow, it's connecting to beauty, sensuality, our senses, maybe explore that. FES, Flower Essence Society, also has a book. It's a very, very concise handbook where you can do different quizzes to figure out which one might suit you best. So that might be something to explore this week, or to seek guidance from somebody who's more expert in it if you don't feel comfortable exploring it on your own. So this is a photo that Lynn had made for me some years ago. This is one of the cards from the Nourish Your Whole Self deck that I put together. And this is, again, something that you can access. It's self-published. It's available on Amazon. And this is when I have the Orange Flow series of cards. There are 8 of them. There are 7, well, actually, there are 7 cards that speak to each of the facets of the flow in food and water, and then 1 master card. So this one was about drinking enough water to keep me dynamic and moving. I'm putting maybe a little bit of something orange inside, right? And so what I liked about these cards was just having an affirmation that was inspirational rather than just informational, but it was yet grounded in something very rooted, like the fact that water does keep us moving inside. Cleansing and bathing. I'd like for us to explore just using water with our bodies. And there is an idea out there that we're actually bathing too much. And so maybe look at the balance of your immersion in water, because some would say that we disrupt the skin microbiome, the oils that are on our skin and on our scalp when we use too much soap. So it's kind of interesting. There's a whole kind of theme along this, not bathing too much, or maybe it's how we bathe. The duration. Some of my best ideas arrive in a hot shower. I'm just standing there in the hot shower feeling very relaxed. And I've been experiencing not just the ideas in a hot shower, but I've also been doing some of my own kind of pulsing with cold water too. And this is part of the Wim Hof method. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's known as the Iceman. He does a lot of the breathing techniques. I've referred to him as part of this experience that we've been having within the Chakra Immersion. He also does some things with cold water and how it stimulates the immune system. So if you're interested, I would say look into that some more. But an old naturopathic medicine principle is to do the pulsing. So kind of do the hydrotherapy of hot and cold. And that stimulates a lot of the flow of the vessels, right? To kind of and even if we think of sauna use, you go in something hot or warm and then you come out and you constrict and you change the flow of blood, lymph, oxygen, all these things. And then you might go and dip into a cold bath. So, or go outside into the snow as Scandinavians might do, or people in Asia, depending on where they're at. So let's look at how we use water as a method with cleansing and bathing. All right. So with water, let's move on to the urinary tract and kidneys. All of which to say, I just want us to look at the structure here and looking at the kidneys themselves, which are not as low as some people think they are. I mean, they're pretty high up in the mid-back region, okay? And then you've got the kidneys, and above the kidneys, you have the adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidneys. And then you have the ureters, the urethra, the bladder, which holds the urine, and that whole process of micturition and making urine, right? And how complex it is, all these kidney tubules. And one of the things that I learned when I was researching a lot of detoxification principles is that just when you think you're getting a toxin out because it's going through the kidneys and moving through and going to be excreted in the urine, it can be resorbed in the kidney tubules. So there is a process in a different osmotic gradient that can cause resorption. And in fact, Jeff Bland and I, years ago, well, Jeff is very keen on this whole concept of alkalinization. And in some cases, for some toxins, when we create more of an alkaline environment by giving more, whether it's potassium or, changing ionic status. And keep in mind that the blood, is going to stay at a pretty constant pH, 7.35 to 7.45. But you have other body compartments that have more of a flux. And so when we take in water, and just the different foods that we eat can create different pHs depending on the range of whatever that is. If we're looking at saliva, if we're looking at urine has a wide range. And it's really kind of the end product of the culmination of many different metabolic pathways and excretion processes, right? Another thing that I found to be really curious, and if you're looking at this, when you looked at it quickly, I'm wondering if you even thought it was like the reproductive system, right, for women. And so this makes me think of, when I think of the flow, I think of the power of two and then a creative incubator. And so when I think of the urinary tract, seeing here the kidneys, much like the ovaries. Then we have these tubes, much like the fallopian tubes. And then we've got the bladder, which is much like the uterus. Isn't that amazing? So kind of interesting to have a similar flow-like structure, the power of two interrelating with either creation or excretion. So again, you know that I like to think symbolic about these things. So kidneys are really important for establishing internal water balance, of course. They're one of the important organs in detoxification. And I think that they often get left off of that list. If I think of where most of the nutritional focus is, I take a sip of my tea here. It's mainly with the gut, and it's mainly with the liver, isn't it? I mean, many times we hear about liver and gut when it comes to detoxification, and kidneys are kind of parked on the side, and we don't see as many supplements that focus on the diuretic process of how different nutrients aid in getting things out of the body or facilitate water excretion or excreting more of certain substances through the conduit of water. So I think about water balance tying into blood pressure. I think about the kidneys with the different hormones that are produced to have diuretic effects or have blood pressure effects. So there's a lot there with the angiotensin converting enzyme, renin. You know, we're not going to get into all of that, but I want you to think about this balancing aspect of flow. And I do want to bring in a discussion briefly of salt. Now, when we think of salt, typically I think of the root because it's a mineral. And so we are looking at something solid and crystalline and kind of a mineral-like structure, even though when we're thinking of a salt, typically we're thinking of, most of us think of table salt, which is sodium chloride. But there are many different kinds of salts. And so when we put a mineral salt together with something, like we can create a salt by having calcium together with a fatty acid, creates a salt of a particular fat. And so bringing in perhaps looking at salt and your salt intake. Are you salt sensitive? You know, there's this idea that, you shouldn't have too much salt. That's going to cause you to swell, but not everybody has that same propensity. There's some genomic and genetic variability in that. Certain ethnic groups can be more sensitive to that. Might also depend on other things in the food. But just to look at, one of my favorite things is just to even have a pink Himalayan salt bath. In fact, my husband just got back from Aikido. He does martial arts, and he was talking about Epsom salts. And I said, why don't you just use the pink Himalayan salt? You know, it's very balancing. It feels good. It does. What's nice about Epsom salts is that it's magnesium sulfate. So you get magnesium theoretically. And people always talk about, get my magnesium through a bath. There's not a lot of data suggesting that magnesium gets in through the skin and has this effect. But I think just taking a bath with salt has a relaxation effect, doesn't it? So maybe exploring the reason why I brought in the pink Himalayan is because it coincides more with the flow. It's kind of a root flow food or substance, if you will. And so what about bringing in some different types of salts and even experimenting? I have a lot. I must admit, I'm very drawn to different types of salts. I have a black salt from Hawaii. I have different types of salts with different things added to them, like jalapeno peppers or different kinds of herbal salts. I think that they're really fascinating. And we may be dehydrated in some way because we don't have enough salt, and we may be more adrenally taxing our reserves and our mineralocorticoids, which might lead us to actually crave a bit more salt. So pay attention to it's not just your water status, but it's your salt intake as well. Those two things, again, it's the dynamic duo. Flow is always about the duo. And so with water, the counterpart typically is salt. All right, the reproductive system. We will course through this. This is one of my favorites. The reproductive system, here we kind of have something which might resemble what we just looked at, right? The urinary tract, and now we've got the reproductive tract, at least in women. I'm focusing here more on women because we have women in the course. So as I have here, creativity is a fertile garden of possibilities we hold within. Yeah, ovaries. Those are these incredible vortices of creativity. Then we've got these finger-like projections, which are in a magical, I mean, it's just amazing. Like when you start to read about the fallopian tubes and you kind of watch a video of an egg being fertilized, like that this could even happen because it feels so willy-nilly. It really feels flowy. It doesn't feel like it's very structured and organized. I mean, it is structured and organized when it gets to the point of cellular replication, but the whole process of sperm meeting egg is quite, I don't even know how that happens if you look at the actual process. But yeah, the beauty of this, right? Our organs of creation, the outright ones, the reproductive tract, and really, I love all the art that is available on the reproductive system for women. There are some great artists and illustrators out there who have done a lot of great work. This is just simple stock, Shutterstock art that I have here. But I love the idea of the heart in the middle, the flowers, you know, the very feminine feel of the reproductive tract. And thinking about the menstrual cycle, we move with the moon. Even if we're not menstruating anymore, we move with the moon. We still have emotions. You know, it's, if you think of it as like sandwich layers, emotion, moon at the top, emotions, menses. And if we don't have the menses, we are still being impacted by the moon. And aside from the fact that we may not actually be producing the flow of blood, we still have even slight hormonal rhythms. Men have hormonal rhythms just in a more subtle way. And as they start to lose and have a hormone decline, that is typically referred to as andropause, whereas for women it's menopause, right? And so menstrual cycle basics. And so I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the menstrual cycle because you're not here to learn that per se. But what I do want to mention is that if you are menstruating or if you are in cycle with the moon, with your emotions, one of the things that you can do, and I've done this for some years, is to look at when we're ovulating, you know, that around that day 14, and then there's kind of that window of, you know, the initial phase of building up to this thicker uterine lining, which then breaks down. So the first half of the cycle from day one to day 14, I see as more of the estrogen building cycle. And so when I think of the estrogen building cycle, that's usually when I ramp up and I'm very determined and I have lots of activity and I feel much more go-getting. And so if I have like a lot of things to do in terms of like deliverables and just knocking things out, I try to plan for that in my more estrogen rich phase. And then when we kind of move into the progesterone phase, to me that usually feels, at least in my body, it doesn't feel as go-getting and ambitious. It feels very creative. It feels softer. It feels dreamier. It feels more emotional. And so this is when I like to focus on more like actually putting together presentations, thinking about the flow of concepts. I might do a little bit more journaling during this time. But I know that other people have talked about this for themselves, and I don't even know how I got turned on to the idea. I think I was just noticing for myself that there were certain peaks within my 28 to 30 day cycle that I just naturally had more energy because it was tracking with estrogen. And estrogen is a yang hormone and progesterone is a yin hormone. And so I just thought, okay, I'm going to work with my body to kind of see how things line up in that regard. Estrogen is pretty young, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It is very protective. It can be protective in the right balance. And, you know, it can help us with heart function, with liver and lipids. And in fact, it's so important for women and men, but more women, because women tend to have more estrogen in their bodies until they're menopausal, to track your labs, your lipid labs, with your day of your cycle. So usually what I like is to aim for my blood lipids at around day 19 to 21, when I'm now past that ovulatory phase, right? And so estrogen is waning. It's at its nadir. And so now you don't have the effects of estrogen. You can just look at the lipids on their own. Bone health, which is why we start seeing osteopenia, which is low bone mineral density, and osteoporosis, and women who are losing their estrogen as they go through menopause and become postmenopausal. Skin, the plumpness of skin and collagen is connected to estrogen. Brain health, we have certain receptors in the brain that are specific to certain types of estrogenic activity. So that's in part why also when women go through menopause, cognitive function changes, memory starts to change. And I don't want to say declines, because it may not decline. Secondary sex characteristics like pubic hair and breast growth are connected to estrogen being present in the body. Too much estrogen, or not the right forms of estrogen, can create imbalance and lead to, within a perfect storm, so to speak, using a flow metaphor, we can also create a tsunami of an effect here with different estrogen metabolites against an ocean of different genes, right? So whether it's breast cancer, estrogen responsive genes, and having a lot of whether it's different hydroxylated estrogen forms. The ovary is also one of the main producers of estrogen. And so when our ovaries go into ovarian decline, many times what we can see is less estrogen in the body, and there are ways to create vitality with the ovaries. We're going to talk about that next week. And then the uterus is also primed to respond to the estrogen levels in the body because of the lining. The lining of the uterus becomes more thick in the presence of estrogen, ready for an egg to become fertilized and to embed into that endometrium and to start to grow. So estrogen is a potent molecule, and it's just like anything else. It's a spectrum. It's got its good side and its not so good side. Well, this is a very sciencey slide, and where did I take this from? I took this from Metagenics has a great report written up on, it's called an answer article, ASNR, an answer article. I forgot what that acronym stands for, but it's some kind of journal, and we've been using this for teaching for years and years and years, talking about the complexity of estrogen, right? And so I'm not going to, take you down into the rabbit hole of all of this, but I thought you might find this interesting, that it's not just, when we hear the word estrogen, it's not just estrogen. It's like, if we start over here on the far left where it says production with the red square around it. So sex hormones come from cholesterol, which is why we don't want cholesterol to go too low. We are converting there. If you were to see all these sex hormones together, you would see that they all kind of funnel into each other. So testosterone goes into estrogen, progesterone goes into testosterone and estrogen. They're all interrelated. So it's a fine line what makes us a man or a woman, because these hormones are all kind of, it's about the amounts of them, but really we contain all of them, and the biochemical pathways would have our bodies making them in a very interconnected way. So we can have different types of estrogen. We can have estradiol, which I call the more yang proliferative estrogen. We can have estrone, which is a more yin type of estrogen. And estrogen it's very interesting because estrogen needs to be detoxified from the body. It goes through liver detoxification processes, much like a pesticide would, which is why when we hear about endocrine disruptors, it's connecting into this whole idea of how estrogen is now, we're getting xenoestrogens from the environment that are acting like estrogens and ramping up pathways that should not be ramped up, and creating distortions and different metabolites that are creating proliferation and cancer. So this becomes very concerning. That this is the work too of Dr. Eleanor Rogan, who has looked into, if you look at the blue box, how estrogen is metabolized. Dr. Eleanor Rogan did some incredible work on this. You can actually get a urine test and find out how you are metabolizing estrogen into these different components. And the 16 up at the top, the 16 alpha hydroxyestrone, and the one in the bottom, 4 hydroxyestrone, are thought to be the more toxic forms of metabolized estrogen, whereas the one in the middle, the 2 hydroxyestrone, is thought to be the more protective. It's not necessarily like protective, like good, like we want it, but it's better than the other ones. So typically when you do a urine test, you get a ratio of how these different metabolites stack up. And then you can have certain nutrients from food, like for example, broccoli in the cruciferous family will modify how much of that 2 hydroxyestrone you're making. It'll err on the side of more 2 and less of the 16 alpha. So for people who have certain gene variants, that could be a really good thing. And then it's also about, if we look up at the top, how estrogen is binding to certain tissues. And so there are certain types of receptors. There are the estrogen receptor alpha, estrogen receptor beta, and they work very different, and they're in different proportions in different parts of our bodies. And we can turn on certain genes by binding first to the tissue that then sends the signal to the cellular DNA to make the protein in the message. So sometimes it's just about the binding, the communication, the relationship between estrogen and the receptor, the lock and key. Another symbol of flow, how enzymes work, right? Lock and key. There's a lot of nuance to that. And then if we look at the bottom into the excretion realm, how are we excreting estrogen? How are we flowing and letting go of estrogen through the stool? Most, we can get estrogen metabolites in the urine. We can also get it in the stool or the feces. And so looking at the gut microbiome and how the gut microbiome produces certain enzymes that can deconjugate a lot of these estrogen metabolites that have already been formed. So I'm speaking a lot. Some of you are pretty sciencey and pretty well versed in this already. Others of you are thinking like, wah, 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 wah. I don't know what she's talking about. I would just say, you can pause on this diagram, just kind of look at it. Ask me questions if you want. I'm happy to get into, in 2011, I toured to South Africa. I did a whole seminar on women's health. I was touring all over the world giving this seminar. So this is pretty, I love this stuff. I really like focusing on hormones and estrogen and all the things that our body does with it. So feel free to ask questions. I really love, I'm just bringing forth this part. Perhaps it speaks to what I was saying about gauging your cycles of creativity with your cycles of menstruation or the cycles of the moon, or your energy levels. So again, if you're not menstruating, mapping out your energy, mapping the moon, mapping the emotions. Perhaps you've already been doing this in the first week, which is great. You'll get a lot of great information. And then plugging in your creativity patterns. And so you're almost, it's like being more creative when you can be creative because you're actually feeling in the flow. So I love this quote. Dr. Spiroff is extremely well known in the fields. He's a gynecologist. This is from an old article, but I love it. I love this quote. And normally, to be honest, I'm not always listening to gynecologists who are male, but Dr. Spiroff is great respect in the field and has had so much wisdom. So the scientific study of menstruation has been hampered by the overpowering influence of traditions and social beliefs. We have all, men and women, been conditioned to view menstruation in a negative way, kind of like it's dirty. Perhaps it is time to look at menstruation from another point of view. How many fine novels have been finished in a burst of creativity in the premenstrual period? How many great ideas have been born premenstrually? What if we could go back and look at the menstrual lineage of what women have produced over time to see the fits and starts of things and how that aligns to creative projects? And again, this is why I'm saying to maximize and harness and harvest these times of your greatest flow, the greatest hormonal flux and dance within you. And there's a lot around fertility and diet, of course. I'm not going to get into that as much. You can pause on this slide and kind of read it. I'm going to cover this more with food in week 3. This is kind of setting the stage for that. There is definitely a connection between flow, fertility, and the foods that we're eating, all these F's. And in fact, the menstrual cycle is connected to the rhythm of antioxidants. This is a very fascinating study for me. This was the Journal of Nutrition at the bottom. You can see it, 2016. It was a prospective study, meaning they set out to look at this. It was not retrospective. It wasn't epidemiological. It was a prospective study asking the research question, what are the levels of antioxidants throughout up to 2 menstrual cycles? Now, my preference is always to look at 3 cycles consecutively in order to look at an effect, but this study did use 2. Antioxidants measured 5 to 8 times during the cycle, and what these researchers found was that there was a pattern. Vitamin C was associated with higher progesterone and with lower follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. The ratio of alpha to gamma tocopherol, so this is vitamin E, 2 different isomers of vitamin E, was associated with an increased risk of not ovulating. So that was interesting. There's some depth into all of this, and we're not going to get into that. But what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that your body is fluxing and flowing with nutrients depending on where you are in your cycle, if you're cycling. So if you are going in to get your nutrients measured, be consistent on the day that you're getting those labs done. What day of your cycle? Is it day 3 or is it day 9? I like to get all my labs done at the same time, days 19 through 21. And usually labs will advocate that as well. Carotenoids, the orange colored components in nature, in plant tissues, have been identified in ovarian tissue. This was a study published in Oncology Reports 2005 with 100 women with a wide age range. And what they found was that, I believe they were looking in these women, they had women with tumors and women without tumors. I believe this was a Polish study looking at how there were carotenoids that were embedded and lodged into the ovary. So there's a reason why we have orange colored or carotenoids, specifically things like beta carotene, or why is it that the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans through the process of ovulation? Corpus luteum means yellow body. What's making it yellow? It's the retinol, it's the beta carotene, it's the carotenoids. So this is a painting that I made. After I was done with it, I looked at it, and this was conception. This was definitely conception, where you see the light, the egg and the sperm have met. There's a lot of dance and squiggly and squirreliness all around, and it's juicy and playful, and then there is this spark of life. So I did mention already the connection to the gut microbiome and estrogen. That is a pretty well-defined relationship. And so you can get, if you give a stool sample and you send it to certain labs, you can get a measure of beta-glucuronidase, which is one of the enzymes that some of these probiotic organisms actually use. It it takes the conjugated group away from estrogen so that it's reabsorbed. And we don't always want that to happen, especially in somebody who has imbalanced estrogen. So working on estrogen can mean working on the gut microbiome. And so that's very consistent with the relationship that we have with the gut microbiome, right? With the flow. All right, so you've got your activities for this week, which you may have already seen. Some of the ideas that I have here is track your weekly water intake. Just like you were tracking your emotions last week, now track your water intake on a piece of paper. Include herbal teas, so things without caffeine. And I talked about the average recommendation there, but just see how you do. Pick one day and notice all things fluid in your life and how it feels to interact with the water. So pick one day that you dedicate fully to all things water element. So you're observing how you're drinking water. How do you drink tea? How are you drinking beverages? Are you taking a shower? What is your observation? How do you feel that your body is receiving the water? Sipping soup, having broth. And what does it feel like? How does it feel to take these things in? I do have some reading for you and some videos if you're interested. I do have my own story of how creativity helped to heal myself. And I'd like you to be thinking about your own story regarding your creativity. Has creativity played a role in your bodily healing in some way? And where is there room for that to come into your life? For the science of creativity and healing, there is a great article. And this is, if you click on the link, it'll take you to the full article. This is one of my favorite articles. It's a 2010 article. It goes through expressive writing. It goes through art. It goes through, I think it goes through movement in some way, expressive movement. It's a really good article. If you are in the health profession, or even if you're just curious for yourself, like, okay, what has evidence for healing? This is a nice article for that, and it is open access. And then for fun, there's an article for you, or I'm sorry, a video for you to listen to. I'm going to let you be surprised by that link and note any bodily sensations from listening to it and track those in your journal. Just jot down some notes. And another, for some of you who are doing a more journal-heavy experience through the chakra immersion, what you may want to do is do something very similar to what you did with the 7 creatives, where you choose a creative and have a dialogue. Now, pick one of your flow body parts. Maybe it's your uterus. Maybe it's your intracellular water. Maybe it's your bladder. And talk with it or write with it, like as if you were having a dialogue with it. And speak from that body part's perspective too, to see what they have to say. And with your partner, here's an idea. You can talk about whatever you'd like, but this is just an idea. Talk about what you discovered in your activities on your body and water. So how it was to drink water, how it was to be in the shower, if you had soup, just anything. If you were outside in the rain, did you go for a swim? Anything in any way that your body interfaces with water, just have a discussion on that. I think that you might find that pretty fun and playful. All right, everybody, that concludes week 2. And again, I'm not aiming for any particular time on these videos. I'm always thinking of shorter, but then they end up a little longer. So, but you're always free to pause and pick up at some place somewhere. So enjoy the week. Let your body experience flow. Pay attention to your body's rhythms, its hydration status, your urine, your menstrual cycle, if you happen to get it this week, if you are cycling, and go with that. So enjoy, everybody. Take care.